Hjartanlega velkomin. Very warm welcome. Thank you all for coming on this extra day on the year, 29th of February. It's a long Thursday. And we are hosting our first talk series person of the year, our first guest of talk series, Dr. Sabeth Buchmann. Welcome. And I just wanted to introduce her a little bit, and then we delve into her talk. Sabeth is a professor of modern and postmodern art and the head of the Institute for Art Theory and Cultural Studies at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And her lecture is titled Infrastructures on Trial. And to just give you a the short version of it, in the wake of the so-called ethnographic turn, respectively of site and context-specific research in the visual and performative arts of the 90s, much artistic practice presented and still presents itself as learning exercise, theatrical rehearsal, scientific experiment, and/or laboratory test. Therefore, the lecture will examine the expanding fields of artists, curators, activists, and writers who share an interest in experimental methods and collective knowledge production, methods that expand the focus on specific places through an examination of the ways in which cultural institutions interact and communicate with social groups. Accordingly, questions will be asked about the way in which material infrastructures or immaterial infrastructures of communication and information, of travel and transportation became part of aesthetic practice. Sabeth Buchmann, a little bit about her. Since 2004, she's been professor of the history of modern and postmodern art in Vienna, as I told you before, and she's currently heading the Institute for Art and Cultural Studies. Now, she's editor of Polypen, a series of art criticism and political theory. She is board member of the art magazine Texte zur Kunst and of the European Kunsthalle. Recent publications include Kunst als Infrastruktur from 23. She's co-editor of Broken Relations, Infrastructure, Aesthetics and Critique in 22. Co-editor of Putting Rehearsals to the Test, Practices of Rehearsals in Fine Arts, Film, Theater, Theory and Politics in 2016. So here's a little bit of background, but now let's get into it. Sabeth, very warm welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us. Here we go.
Marcus, thank you so much for this very nice welcome and introduction. And I also, of course, would like to thank Odur and Margaret Elisabeth. It was an overwhelming, welcoming here in Reykjavik, and also the possibility to meet with colleagues, with students, with artists. I had fabulous studio visits today. It's really a very enriching experience here, and I'm more than thankful. And also, thank you, Martijn, who brought me here. Martijn, I know from a kind of mutual exchange about the topic of infrastructure. So, I really, really feel very much honored. So, the current view of contemporary art institutions confront us with a particular urgency to scrutinize the structural change of social communication, a change that also affects the relationship between art institutions and their publics. The pessimistic diagnosis of the erosion of the public sphere as a result of its corporatization and privatization is not new, a diagnosis that represents, to a certain extent, the DNA of institutional critique. Therefore, it is my hypothesis that through institutional critique, the structures of communication between institutions and the public also represents a prerequisite of artistic practice as such. By this, I mean, first of all, artistic claims to participate in forms and channels by which institutions interact with the public. A recent example of the relevance of infrastructural thinking is the activity of Gulf Labor Coalition, you certainly know, addressing the Guggenheim complex as an exemplary symptom of neoliberal corporate culture which maximizes its profits through cheap work by exploited and disfranchised migrants, in this case in Arabic countries, but we know that this is also the case in Western countries. With these projections, you can see in the slide, on the building, the institution was forced to communicate its complicity with a global system of exploitation. As we can all observe with regard to political movements and social struggles, as well as to the effects of the neoliberal politics of austerity, and to the expansion of social media, the self-awareness of the public as a vulnerable asset has expanded through an awareness of critical infrastructures. According to relevant definitions, critical infrastructures include information and communication media that are intertwined into supply chains, transportation systems, healthcare, etc. Infrastructures can be defined as interdependent structures lying beneath, behind, and between the orders and that control our radius of actions and interactions, movements, fantasies, and desires. The increased artistic awareness of the importance of infrastructures, of course, has an impact on normative evaluations of art and institutions. With that, I mean the requirement of system relevance, which has only especially to the fore during the pandemic and the associated lockdowns, and which turned the discussion on and off infrastructures also into a discussion of the framework conditions of artistic autonomy. Yeah, since if you speak about interdependent relations, that of course also questions the idea of autonomy to a certain extent. Since talking about infrastructures implies a recognition and appreciation of mutual dependencies, this has of course consequences for the self-image of artists and institutions as more or less autonomous social actors. Since during and after the pandemic we got used to the distinction between system-relevant and dispensable infrastructures, they came under pressure to assert and prove their relevance to the system. Against this background, I would like to discuss the meaning of infrastructures for the ways in which institutions demand social relevance through the way they work with artists, and vice versa, how artists communicate their work with and within institutions to the public. With reference to three American authors, architectural theorist Keller Easterling, art theorist Marina Wishschmidt, and anthropologist Brian Larkin, I therefore would like to look with you at two artistic examples that in each specific way turn material infrastructures into media for and of public communication. As we will see in the case of my first example, Andrea Fraser's really well-known museum highlights gallery talks from 1989, the criticism of an idealistic understanding of aesthetic autonomy goes hand in hand with the criticism of an idealistic understanding of the public. Here you see some images from her performance, and I just want to introduce to those who might not know it. This was from, as I said, from '89, and under the pseudonym Jane Castleton, Fraser's performative tours as museum guide led first to all museums' infrastructural function areas: water dispensers, museum shop, cloakrooms, a stool for the museum guards, lamps, spotlights, path systems, and so on. So I show you a clip.
Next, I'd like to talk about another period room. It's just across the gallery. This This is a paneled room from England, dating from 1625. It contains 17th century Dutch paintings and was installed in the museum in 1953. And in here, this is the men's room. What a difference there may be on opposite sides of a thin partition wall. On this side is a family inclined to dirt and disorder because of its unperfect social education. Cleanliness of persons and rooms is wholly forgotten. The floors become littered with filth because no one feels the desire or the obligation to have it otherwise. The rights of property are disregarded or respected only through fear and personal force. On this side of the wall, only a few inches away, the floor, neatly carpeted, is spotless. The center table holds a lamp and a vase with fresh-cut flowers. There are pictures on the walls, a landscape or the family. One may even find a bureau turned into a shrine.
What we observe in Fraser's performance is, of course, a presentation of the museum at the one hand as an art institution, but also as a kind of infrastructural space. Those works are about the activation of a central awareness of the usually invisible, at the same time indispensable institutional infrastructures. As it's well known, institutional critique stands for the activation of a sensitivity regarding mechanism of social inclusion and exclusion. Looking at the images and the video, this definition can be also understood as in situ participation into institutional infrastructures. According to Fraser, institutional critique can only be determined by a methodology of critical reflexive site specificity. Accordingly, the artist characterizes museum highlights is as a kind of social history of art museum in the United States, with a spatial attention to the relationship between social class and taste, private philanthropy, and the public interest in creating museums, but also culture in the urban public space. In my eyes, museum highlights illustrate that and to what extent institutional critique has paved the way to an infrastructural analysis of institutions which does not only address the restrictions and blind spots of aesthetic autonomy, but at the same time claims to redefine it with regard to art education and institutional codes of communication. Museum Highlights therefore reveals the ambiguity of institutional critique as a method of relativizing and expanding the realm of the aesthetic at the same time. Therefore, I would like to maintain that we perceive Fraser's ethnographic field research as a performative act of artistic nominalism in the tradition of the ready-made, as if given infrastructures would become a work of art at the moment the artist turns them into objects of consideration. Objects that appear as constellation of material phenomena and physical networks, as well as immaterial relation and symbolic actions which, in visible and invisible ways, also shape our horizon of aesthetic perception. I'm not speaking here of relational aesthetics in the sense of French curator Nicolas Bourriaud. Rather, I refer to Brian Larkin's thesis, according to which infrastructures can be understood as repetitive system formation, which characterizes an elusive ontology consisting of concrete semiotic and aesthetic vehicles that can be at the same time functional and dysfunctional. This also means that the shifting location of infrastructures between object and system also can include broken relations that show themselves to us as prerequisites of the aesthetic. In order to underline the thesis, I also quote Marina Wischmidt's 2016 essay, Between Not Everything and Not Nothing, Cuts Towards Infrastructural Critique. To say that infrastructure repeats means that it works to enable a set of activities, and it works because the precondition of its effectivity are neither visible nor relevant. This jut out when the infrastructure breaks down or if an element is isolated from the whole. The dumbwaiter bound to slave labor carries bottle after bottle up to Jefferson's dining room. Its systemic properties tend to become visible only when the repetitions cease. If the wine ceases to appear at some level and only for an instant, the entire apparatus of slavery comes into view. When you turn on the faucet or the water does not flow, the entire water system leaps into the cognitive field. End of quote. The way Wischmidt addresses local and global labor markets as well as corporate power constellation, ownership relations, and the structural conditions of capitalism touches on infrastructures that are intertwined with the art field. Therefore, calling totalizing concepts of institutions into question, the theoretician declares, in contrast to Fraser, not topographic categories like place and site alone, but also time and reproduction to be the central category of infrastructural critique. As we can read it here, time is an infrastructure because it is a condition of possibility for conscious perception and action. Infrastructure is made of time insofar as infrastructure is that which repeats. Looking at my second example, a long-term study of the formats of communication between institutions and their internal and external publics, I would like to approach possible correspondences with Wischmidt's shift from institutional to infrastructural critique. Realized between 2014 and 16 at the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts at Harvard University, Austrian artist Martin Beck's project Program was an exhibition divided into 10 episodes. I leave it here. Into 10 episodes that were spread over a period of 2 years. Comparable to Fraser's museum highlights, the content of the episodes was an art institution. In his case, as I said, the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, designed by the French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier. I show here some materials Martin Beck compiled from the archive of the Carpenter Center in order to get an idea of how the institution was composed. And these images here I show you this way is about the way how he started his communication with the director and curator of the Carpenter Center, with whom he started a communication of how to communicate between the institution and the artist. And it was represented in this kind of poetic representation of his thoughts. So here we are at the Carpenter Center. Completed in 1963, the institute consists of an interdisciplinary research center and an exhibition place. When the former director of the Carpenter Center, James Voorhees, invited back in 2013 to redesign the coffee bar, the artist had literally put this commission on hold for several reasons. Because the institutional commissioning of artists to design service areas had already become at that time a practice which helped art institutions to transform themselves into lifestyle consumption spheres as part of global corporate culture, keyword barista coffee. Therefore, Beck felt compelled to invent a form of conversation about the condition of artistic participation and of his function to create an image of institutional communication with the public. Therefore, he created drafts that he formatted and published as PDFs and sent them to Voorhees at irregular intervals. In this way, the artist and the curator communicated about the project development, which oscillated between site-specific research, external studio practice, exhibition, and mediation programs. Insofar as the diagrammatic instruction that I just showed to you, sorry, I go back. This I mean by the diagrammatic drafts he then created. And insofar this diagrammatic instruction consisted of archive fragments, as I showed you here, and some thoughts, definitions of terms, personal diary notes, photographic recordings, poetic reflections. They resembled conceptual practices of artistic scores for long-term experiments. Since a diagram is not the perfect medium of information, but of speculative thinking, its function was to play through process notes and project ideas in linguistic and visual media, which appear sometimes useful and sometimes useless, which can sometimes evoke kind of functional maneuvers or sometimes poetic stubbornness. After a period of negotiation, Beck turned the diagrams into instructions for 10 mini exhibitions of specific episodes from the history of the institution, an idea that simultaneously sought to address institutional infrastructures as both aesthetically constitutive and determining forms. Based on the model of episodic television series, program was focused on the institution's communication channels. According to Beck's definition of the episode, these are temporally structured elements. I confused the images a bit. Sorry, I go back to here so that you can read it. An episode can be an incident or event that is part of the progression of a larger sequence. 1B, one of a series of related events in the course of a continuous account. Second, a portion of a narrative that relates an event or a series of connected events and forms a coherent story in itself, an incident. 3. A separate part of a serialized work, such as a novel or play. 4. A section of classic Greek tragedy that occurs between two choric songs. 5. Music, a passage between statements of a main subject or theme, as in a rondo or fugue. The list of definitions shows that an episode serves at the same time as distinct aesthetic form and as relation between two or more elements. Even though it can represent a unity, it leaves us wondering about the next two, the in-between, the behind, the in front of, the before and the after. In other words, the present form always consists of a multitude of dia and synchronic relations. Due to time constraints, I can only talk about 3 exemplary episodes which dealt with the room design, the wall labels, the press release, and the artist lecture. In addition, program consisted of distinct presentation of a poster and a DVD, a welcome gift for the students, the internal public, so to speak, a film screening, and an exhibition. So I begin with episode 1. Called Removed and Applied, which carried out the transformation of the exhibition container within the so-called third gallery of the Carpenter Center, which you see here in 4 different forms. As documented by Beck, Le Corbusier wanted his building to be understood as a breathing organism that was dedicated to experimental and purpose-free research in art, design, and visual culture. The metaphor of the breathing organism manifests itself in the curved and iconic ramp which takes in the interior like a wind tunnel and which connects the outside with the inside of the building. The claim to organicity was also underlined by the open and honeycomb like rooms, the large window fronts, and 2 galleries, including the third gallery and the end of the ramp, the heart of the Carpenter Center, in which some of Beck's episodes took place. I go back to the exhibition container that Beck made into an object of communication about the history of the exhibition space that was installed around 2000 by a designer team called Peter Rose and Partners. According to the director of the Carpenter Center at the time, Le Corbusier's spatial design is suboptimal for the presentation of works of art, especially when they are sensitive to light. So here you can see again Le Corbusier's architectural design, this idea of a breathing organism. He also drew this representation of a plant-like figure in order to illustrate his architectural idea. And this was what Martin Beck took up, and I just miss this one, took up because Le Corbusier himself, he saw the problem of his space, that it didn't work with the art pieces, and therefore he suggested to use a curtain. And this curtain then disappeared. This was removed after the container was built in to the exhibition space, and Martin Beck's gesture was then to reintegrate this curtain in order to show how the atmosphere, how the play with the light could be also seen as part of the infrastructural device. In this way, it became visible that and to what extent light and atmosphere are part of infrastructures that determine aesthetic conditions. However, by installing the container, this infrastructural element should lose its function and only have a decorative character. While Le Corbusier sought to incorporate architectural space, light, and climate, and thus material and immaterial infrastructure into aesthetic considerations, Rose and partners built in a traditional white cube, and with it an institutional display that was sought to isolate art from disturbing influences such as natural light. But this concept of autonomous art went along with the installation of more market-compliant infrastructure. Originally covered, and I go back, originally covered with steel plates, Beck reversed its function as an inverted white cube. After removing the steel plates, as you can see in the images, the artist covered the outside of the exhibition box with plasterboard and painted it white. The way in which the inside of the exhibition box was integrated into its outside through the new cladding was doubled. Removed and applied could be read as both, as a site-specific and time-based process that documented the communication function of spatial infrastructures. Remarkably, Beck's episode, presented in October 2014, is reminiscent of Michael Escher's reversal of interior to exterior spaces, as well as his interventions in prevailing wall, floor, ceiling systems. One could think of an intervention dated 1988 in New York artist space, as you can see it here in the image, which consisted of raising the partition walls to that they touched the ceiling. The US-American artist, whose work is considered as utmost relevant for the emergence of institutional critique in the 1970s, used found drywall materials and attached it to the existing wall structure with screws. Insofar as he left the surface of the wall extension untreated, the grayish color of the product logo of the building material were visible. The space surrounded by the extended wall remained empty, making the technical and material infrastructure the central subject to the scenario. Beck's reference to Escher's transformation of alternative spaces, such as Artist Space in New York, into commercial white cube galleries, reflected in the late 1980s, also played into the first episode of program, the removal of the approximately 70 panels of the metal panels. Clothing then was loaded onto trucks by professional staff and transported to the university warehouse. The surface of the box, which was reminiscent of a goods container, disappeared from the visitor's field of vision. The way in which functional infrastructures only became an issue through their absence correlated with the logistics of its disposal. Insofar as the new surface of the container shifted its white cube functions to the outside, The box functioned as both a technical and aesthetic vehicle for the production of infrastructural objects. This moment is reminiscent of another intervention by Escher, namely the corridor that the artist narrowed in 1969 in the Gladys K. Montgomery Art Center at Pomona College in Claremont, California. An intervention that programmatically thwarted the phantasm of unlimited aesthetic freedom. The artist transformed the lobby of the Montgomery Art Center into a publicly accessible white cube by having its floor painted white and its entrance door removed. The rooms, which Escher converted into a bright tunnel, were accessible day and night. This evoked a quasi-cinematic view of the outside world when stepping out of the gallery spaces, an effect that intertwined site and time-specific modes of perception of their infrastructural dispositions. Comparably, in Removed and Applied, we can observe a similar operation, since the plasterboard panels were filled, sanded, and painted with dull gallery white and provided with a wall label on which the author and the title of the episode, as well as the materials used, were stated. By creating external walls in the original exhibition space, Beck made the spatial infrastructure a room-in-a-room object. In contrast to the concept of unrepeatable site specificity, Beck's exhibition container pointed to the serial character of the global exhibition system. As it well known, biennials and other mobile exhibition formats enable infrastructure building measures for cities and municipalities, including real estate trading and investor architecture, a phenomenon that US-American artist Robert Morris already anticipated in 1967 when he spoke about the dominance of the cube and the cuboid in minimal art as an aesthetic echo of the dominant cultural infrastructure of design. Against those backdrops, Beck's interpretation of the cube lets us read as an episodic medium in order to communicate the historically changed notions, aesthetics, and functions of institutional infrastructures. This form of ambivalence-oriented communication of historically changing meanings also came into play with the second episode. Titled 1963, this part of Beck's program consisted only of a facsimile of the announcement of the opening of the Carpenter Center in 1963. The word-for-word reproduction of the 50-year-old mission statement that promised to improve the visual literacy of Harvard students from all faculties and their unlimited creative development. The press release then was a reproduction exactly of this original historical mission statement and was right now, under the condition of his reproduction, sent via post and email and could also be removed by visitors on site from a plexiglass holder attached to one of the outer walls of the exhibition box. With regard to the thesis of the French media theorist Bernard Stiegler that the same object is able to produce different phenomena each time, the question comes up, what changes could be affected by such a gesture of reproduction? A possible answer lies in the interruption that this type of reproduction implies, or to literally repeat Wishmit's words, to say that infrastructure repeats means that it works to enable a set of activities, and it works because the precondition of its effectivity are neither visible nor relevant. This shut out when the infrastructure breaks down or if an element is isolated from the whole. Remarkably, the literal representation of the press release communicated the idealistic demands of the founders, patrons and planners of the Carpenter Center, amongst them eponymous industrial couple, the Harvard alumni Alfred Sanvrin and Helen Bundy Carpenter. This is how we get informed that the founding of the Institute was preceded by a long-term discussion about the blatant deficiencies in the visual literacy of prospective scientists. Fearing the Russians' advantages in military space exploration, interdisciplinary concept of free creativity in the late 50s and early 60s did, of course, not only aim for artistic freedom, but also for the training of competent and competitive cooperations between art, science, and technology. As can be read in Beck's subsequently published publication, An Organized System of Instructions, in the 9th, and this was the penultimate episode of this project, which was performed as classic artist lecture, he spoke of tests and trials, conversations, requests, proposals, discussions, assumptions and impressions, do's and don'ts, rehearsals and returns, a formulation that can be read as a reflection on the history of the institution as well as of artistic procedure. This ambivalence leads me to the third reference to Keller Easterling's book, Extra Statecraft, The Power of Infrastructure Space, from 2014, in which the architectural theorist calls for a very specific type of exploration of infrastructural dispositions. Distinguishing between well-rehearsed knowledge and under-rehearsed knowledge, she aims at a critical know-how of dealing with corporate, commodified, and colonized spaces. It is only this repeatedly tested knowledge, Easterling states, that enables us to develop an equally competent, critical, and subversive approach to phenomena ranging from microchips and surveillance cameras, shopping malls and holiday resorts, etc. For rehearsal-based methods refer to abilities gained through repetitive practice. They would enable us to transform learned patterns of behavior and movement into emancipatory interactions with spatial relations. In my eyes, Beck's program lets us consider the method of rehearsal as an ambiguous figure of communication. In other words, as a possibility of making at the same time critical and aesthetic use of infrastructures which may no longer have any aesthetic or social function. Accordingly, I understand the serial episodes as method to rehearse new ways of communication between artistic, institutional, and public agents. To clarify what I mean by this, I quote the questions in the 9th episode. Where it is, I lost it, sorry. I quote it. How to continue, when to continue, where to continue. Thinking about the premise, going back to go forward, possibilities and impossibilities. Program, an exhibition stretched out over time. Program, an unfolding of episodes. Sorry for the confusion. Of episodes, program ephemeral and concrete gestures that inhabit institutional sites of public address. And with this, I would like to end and thank you for your attendance and your patience.